How did we take this original Game Boy Color and bring it into the modern age? Let me show you. There's an ongoing debate in the retro gaming world, which is, should you mod your systems because they're more enjoyable to play, or should you keep your systems completely original because once you mod them, the originality's gone and eventually they're all going to be gone. What if we can take aspects from both worlds and combine them? I want to make a sleeper Game Boy or an incognito Game Boy. Basically, I want to take an original Game Boy and make it look completely identical on the outside. However, it's storing a whole bunch of upgrades on the inside. The Game Boy Color was the first Game Boy to have a colored picture, hence the name. Now, unlike the Game Gear, it wasn't backlit, so you'd easily lose the picture. Everybody that had a Game Boy remembers these screens because all of us at one point went on a road trip and we played streetlight to streetlight as we drove down the road. Now, if that wasn't enough, this Game Boy also doesn't have any sound. Let's fix both of these issues. We're going to start by disassembling the Game Boy. To do this, we're going to have to remove the 6 tri-head screws on the back. With those screws out, the back shell can be removed. I got a little ahead of myself and already removed the speaker. In very simplistic terms, a speaker is essentially just a magnet attached to a diaphragm and has a coiled wire around it. Now, when current goes through that coiled wire, it pulls on the magnet, and at certain currents, it's going to shake it different, and that's how you get your sounds when it pulls on the diaphragm. Now, if the wire's broken, then the current's not going to go through it, and it's not going to pull on the magnet, it's not going to shake the diaphragm, it's not going to make sound. Well, I think that's how they work. I've never actually looked it up. I just kind of looked at one day and I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. A quick check you can do to test your speaker is to check if there's continuity. No continuity, no sound. And this one has no continuity. So I'm going to need a new speaker. In the meantime, let's remove this board. We remove the screen by pushing up on these 2 little tabs and then very gently pulling the ribbon out. Now, if you accidentally break the ribbon cable, it's fine. We're replacing the screen anyhow. The PCB itself is held in by 3 Phillips head screws. Once you remove these, the board will pop right out. We'll need to remove the conductive pads and all the buttons and then put them aside in a safe spot so we don't lose them. Using a plastic tool, I gently pried up on the screen to pop it out. Again, if we damage the screen, it's okay, we're replacing it. Using some isopropyl alcohol and then a little bit of pressure, we're able to pop out the old screen lens. This is going to be replaced with a bigger glass one. Now I'll be putting in a Q5 IPS screen, which is bigger than the original screen, so I'm going to have to trim some of the shell. There's a few ways of doing this, however, I prefer power tools. With some movie magic, we're ready to go. I'm also adding a rechargeable battery, and unfortunately this battery with an original shell requires a lot of trimming. And I mean a lot of trimming. Now it looks pretty good right now, but it took me forever to get to this point. You basically have to cut out absolutely everything, so if you're planning on doing this mod, just buy an aftermarket shell. Now that everything is disassembled and cut to what we need, I'm going to give it a quick cleaning because there's some gook in here. Now, because we're going to be adding a lot of mods that pull and add power, I want to make sure that power is being delivered cleanly and efficiently. So I'm going to put in a modern power regulator. Now, I find anything that has multiple pins difficult to remove, especially the transformer on a Game Gear, so if you have a better way of doing this, let me know. But first, I put flux on and then I melt that flux. Then using a solder sucker, I try to remove as much solder as I possibly can. Once I've sucked away as much solder as I possibly can, I go back in with some wick and I try to get any residual stuff. Then by applying very gentle pressure underneath, I put heat to each of the pins until it eventually pries up. So please tell me an easier way in the comments. Now with it painstakingly but successfully removed, I use isopropyl alcohol and Q-tip just to clean up all that old flux. With it all cleaned, we're ready to put on the new power regulator. I did this by anchoring the top left corner and then going through each pin and soldering it down. And it looks pretty clean, just like in the name. Now I'm also going to remove the main capacitor on the board here. The only reason we're doing this is to add a bigger one. I found the best way to solder this capacitor on was to tin the legs and then add heat while it was on the board. Now because IPS screens draw more power from the Game Boy, it sometimes creates an audio interference. Now, sometimes it's ignorable, sometimes it's really loud. However, since I'm putting an audio amp in this system, the sound would be deafening, so we really need this capacitor. On to the audio. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be putting an audio amp into this. I started by prepping the board and adding solder blobs to each of the pads. Then I attached one wire, which is basically just going to anchor it in place so I can start running my wires from there. To install this, I'm following Retro6's guide, which I found on HandHeldLegend's website. Now every part you're seeing in this video was purchased on that website, and I'll have them linked down in the description. With the amp installed, I'm going to move to the IPS screen. To start, I'm going to put packing tape over the window here. This is going to do 2 things. 1, it's going to prevent dust and debris from touching your screen, and 2, if any dust or debris gets in there, it's going to stick to the tape rather than your screen. Using the double-sided tape that's included with the package, I put it on the inside of the shell and then attached my screen. There is a bracket which you can buy separately, which helps you align the screen and secure it in. However, I get good results with just using the double-sided tape alone, so that's what I'm going to stick with for this build. Now, something I forgot to do while the screen was still out was test it, so I'm just going to put the PCB back in really quick and just turn it on to ensure that the screen is in fact working. Oh, thank God for that. That would have sucked. This screen has button controls, so we're going to need to solder on some wires. With these wires on, we can start reassembling some of the Game Boy. We're going to reinstall our buttons and conductive pads, and don't worry about mixing up the buttons, they have guide points which won't allow you to do that. Now this is a good time to clean or just replace your conductive pads. Now while the PCB is still out, we're going to take those wires that we had soldered onto the screen and solder them onto the main board. This is pretty straightforward. You're going to match select with select, B with B, and A with A. Now you won't be soldering to the contact point itself. There's little tester points just above each button that you're going to use. And again, the directions for these will be on HandHeldLegend's website. Once everything's soldered into place, I'm going to tape these wires down so they don't interfere with any other working parts. And I actually ended up trimming these wires a little bit because they're just a little too long and in the way. Now these button controls will allow you to put a battery indicator up, turn on pixel mode, which kind of gives it a retro feel, adjust the brightness, adjust the position, and change the color. Now there is also 2 touch changers on top, which will change the brightness and the color. There's 2 of these little pads that have adhesive already on them, so we're just going to stick them in the corners. With all of our wires soldered and attached, we're going to put the PCB back into the front shell. Then we'll reconnect our new IPS screen into the main board. With the screen installed, let's repair the audio by putting in a new speaker. Out of all the things that can cause no audio in a Game Boy, a broken speaker is probably the easiest to diagnose and repair. Now because we're amplifying this, the speaker is going to solder onto the amp board rather than the main motherboard. Once the new speaker was in, I secured the audio amp down so it wouldn't click around if you shook the Game Boy. Now we can secure the PCB into the front shell. And of course we do this just by returning the original 3 screws that we took out at the beginning of the build. Now it's time for one of the most stressful parts, putting on the screen protector. It's not hard by any means, but if any dust gets in between the screens, it's a real pain to get it out. Before attempting this, I wipe away any dust in my work area, and then I try to do this very quickly so no dust happens to fall in between the screens. We're going to be adding a rechargeable battery to this build. This rechargeable kit comes in 2 parts, so we just have to secure the board to the battery. I did this by bending the pins on the board to touch the terminals on the battery and then taped it down. Now before putting the battery in, we obviously have to put the back shell back on. We're going to do this by returning those 6 tri-head screws back to their original positions. Now installing the battery itself was a little finicky because I kept getting hung up on that spring, but the spring is required so I couldn't just pull it. Anyways, I eventually got it in there and I was able to close the back shell. Now the battery door did close, however it wasn't completely flush, so I had to go back and do some more shell trimming. But eventually I was able to make it all fit perfect and we tested it out. Now we're well on our way to a full charge. With the battery in and tested, now our build is complete. What started off as a soundless Game Boy Color with a light-dependent screen has now turned into this beautiful masterpiece. An IPS screen, a rechargeable battery, a modernized power regulator, and of course, that strong but mighty audio amp. And our final product, a Game Boy Color that completely looks original, front, side, and back. Now, obviously the front glass here is a little bit bigger, so if you're keen, you might notice that. However, if you don't, and you turn it on, here is like my perfect scenario as I hope this will one day go. Oh, no way. I had one of these things growing up. Now, obviously, I don't want that to happen because someone would get hurt, and I don't want a Game Boy that I built to blow up. That would be awkward. Anyhow, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it, and please consider subscribing because I plan on doing much, much more. And with that, let's save the consoles. Have a great night.